Welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for joining us for this very important conversation about the explosion of anti-Semitism and the assault on Israel and world Jewry. Jews in Los Angeles attacked while dining. Jews walking down a street assaulted in the heart of New York City. Synagogues vandalized around the world. Jews across Europe, and now in the United States, removing their kippot and their Magen Davids for fear of being targeted. Of course, also on our minds from recent years are the Pittsburgh and Poway, California synagogue shootings and the Muncie, New York Hanukkah stabbings. So many we could list from around the world, and the list just continues to grow. All that, in addition to the heinous threats leveled against Jews who have an online presence, or even Jews in general via popular social media platforms. The dangerous global phase of anti-Semitism now must be addressed at every level of society. Public officials, diplomats, faith leaders, academics, popular entertainers must speak out quickly and forcefully that anti-Semitism, whether it manifests as physical assault, verbal abuse, or online trolling, is never okay. As an international organization founded in 1843, B'nai B'rith is in a unique position to talk about this explosion of anti-Semitism. With staff and members and supporters around the world, with representation at the United Nations globally, we have the boots on the ground to analyze and to confront this issue in depth. Where's it coming from? And why now? Well, with me today are colleagues from the US, Europe, Latin America, and Israel, here to provide their expertise and insights. Alina Bricman is our Director of European Union Affairs, joining us from Brussels. Eric Fusfield is Deputy Director of our International Center for Human Rights and Public Policy and Director of Legislative Affairs, joining us from Washington, D.C. Jeremy Havardi is Director of the B'nai B'rith United Kingdom Bureau of International Affairs. He joins us from London. Brian Herman is the Director of Government Relations for B'nai B'rith Canada, and he comes to us today from Ottawa. Eduardo Kohn is our Director of Latin American Affairs, joining us from Uruguay. David Michaels is our Director of United Nations and Intercommunal Affairs, and he joins us from New York. And Alan Schneider is our Director of the B'nai B'rith World Center in Jerusalem. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining this conversation today. Well, Eric, let's start out here in the United States. Tell us what you see going on the ground right now, and what ways can we combat it? We're not used to it here. We're not accustomed to it, but it is happening, and we need to counter it now. So tell us what you see.
And you're right. I think we're really in a new era of anti-Semitism here in the United States, with this spate of openly violent attacks against Jewish individuals and institutions, as opposed to a more sort of veiled discrimination that we've seen in the past. This is open violence in some cases, open hostility. And we've seen this, for example, the attack on Jewish diners at the sushi restaurant in Los Angeles, where this was pro-Palestinian protesters who drove by the restaurant and asked the diners, "Are you Jewish?" And then when they indicated that they were, the protesters attacked them. This is the definition of a hate crime that took place in Los Angeles. At the same time, we've had targets attacked in Manhattan at a bagel place, and in the Diamond District. We've had synagogues desecrated in places like Illinois and Utah. So you really have a sense of this happening on a nationwide scale. And I think we've seen the tragic shootings that took place in Pittsburgh and Poway, which you referenced, and those were right-wing hate acts. But what we're seeing now in connection with the conflict in the Middle East is really anti-Semitism of the far left. And I think this demonstrates something that should be one of the takeaways from today's conversation, which is that anti-Semitism does not just emanate from one source. It comes from different places on the spectrum. It comes from the far right, it comes from the far left, and it comes from radical Islamist extremists. And so we need to be mindful of all of these sources of anti-Semitism and not equivocate in opposing all of them, not excuse any of them. So, among the things that we have done is B'nai B'rith has written a letter to President Biden thanking him for openly condemning anti-Semitism. And that's what we need from leadership at the top levels, this unequivocal condemnation of anti-Jewish hatred. And in it, we ask for some specific actions, such as federal funding for security of synagogues and other vulnerable institutions, increased protection for Jewish students on university campuses. This is something we are having an ongoing conversation with the Department of Education about. We need the administration to appoint several key officials at a high level and at a working level who can sharpen the focus on anti-Semitism. I'm talking now about an anti-Semitism envoy, ambassador level at the State Department, but also an official at the Justice Department or Department of Homeland Security who can focus on domestic anti-Semitism, and also a White House liaison to the Jewish community who would really help us carry out a dialogue with the administration as these concerns emerge. We need to continue to push for acceptance of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism, not just among governments and government officials, but among university presidents. We're doing some outreach now to universities to, gain further acceptance of this working definition, because people need to understand that anti-Israel hatred, not just legitimate policy criticism of one government, but anti-Israel hatred, particularly when it incorporates Jewish stereotypes and so forth, this bleeds over into anti-Semitism. And this business that we're witnessing now of certain politicians accusing Israel of being an apartheid state, accusing Israel of being a terrorist state. These are manifestations of anti-Semitism because they're branding, it's an attempt to brand Israel as a pariah. And we've seen that it also leads to the kind of violent outbursts that we're witnessing, because if indeed Israel is an apartheid state, if indeed Israel is responsible for terrorism, which is the opposite of the truth, we know, but if this were true, then shouldn't supporters of Israel here in the United States and elsewhere be held accountable? And this, in part, explains the violence that's being carried out. And finally, I need to reinforce, for leaders of both parties, not just our elected officials, but leaders of institutions, influence shapers in our society, to speak out, with their unqualified condemnation of anti-Semitism. We've seen this from the Senate Task Force on Anti-Semitism, a bipartisan group of senators that issued a strong condemnation. President Biden himself has done that. We wrote him a letter thanking this. But we need more of that. We need to not rationalize or legitimize anti-Semitic hatred, but to condemn it full on. And finally, I think this is also a moment to uphold the principle that was articulated in the OSCE Berlin Declaration of 2004, which B'nai B'rith was present for. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe issued a declaration underscoring the principle that political events in the Middle East or elsewhere can never justify anti-Semitism. So we need to continue to uphold that principle and stand by it in our response to all these anti-Semitic outbursts that we're witnessing now.
Well, that principle really is at the basis of the IRA definition. I was at that meeting in 2004, and that particular principle was the basis for the IRA definition that we now are encouraging people to adopt. And it is as relevant as it could ever be today because of the issue relating to what we've just seen in terms of the fighting between Israel and Hamas and all of the blame that is being heaped upon Israel. Let's move to Canada now. Brian Herman, what have you been seeing on the ground? We've seen incidents in Toronto, which has the largest Jewish population in Canada, and Winnipeg, and in other places. Tell us about what you're seeing and what B'nai B'rith Canada is doing about it.
Our conversation could not have come at a more important time because of recent events. This past month in Canada, it's been extremely difficult for Canadian Jews. There's a real sense of anxiety. Some of the older members of our community say they have not sensed this since the Christie Pitts riots of the 1930s, or the none is too many immigration restrictions of the 1940s and 1950s. We've witnessed Jewish businesses boycotted, Jewish organizations targeted, Jewish students intimidated, and Jewish citizens assaulted. You've mentioned some of the most egregious events, most recently in the city of Toronto, in Montreal, in Winnipeg. It's really stretched across Canada to many other cities as well. Anti-Israel protesters chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, signs reading death to Israel, Zionism is akin to Nazism, abolish Israel, anti-Semitic songs being sung saying, get lost, you son of a Jew. It's really struck Canadians very hard. They've never seen this before. The attacks have been relentless. And there is considerable concern that the phenomenon we're seeing today is that our fellow citizens are not standing up and calling out these forms of anti-Semitism and calling for action, condemning them, and calling for a series of measures that will ensure Canadians are embracing the democracy, the respect for human rights that characterizes our society. From the B'nai B'rith Canada perspective, we're ensuring that the Jewish community knows that we are there to safeguard them and the Jewish way of life. We understand their anxiety, and we want to make sure that their concerns are articulated to all levels of government, but we want them to know that we are there for them and we are there to support them. We're encouraging the reporting of hate crimes and hate incidents, both to our organization and to local police forces. We're backing up individuals when they approach the police with a clear indication of where we see anti-Semitic hate incidents need to be followed up. We're undertaking constant messaging via social media channels on the facts of what is happening in the Middle East. Perhaps what is most disturbing about what we're seeing is the unbalanced, the unfair reporting by the Canadian media, largely, not totally, but largely, about what is happening in the Middle East, highlighting the importance of people drawing on authoritative sources, highlighting where misinformation is leading to misleading people. We're reinforcing the work of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, creating greater awareness of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. But what we're trying to do also is to tell Canadian governments at all levels, federal, provincial, or state and municipal level, that they have to not just adopt the IRA definition, but actually take concrete steps to implement it. And that's why we've been calling for a national action plan led by the federal government to combat anti-Semitism, and that it has to contain specific concrete actions. For the longer term, we need to focus on education. And that is, in Canada, education is at a provincial level of responsibility. We want mandatory and consistent education about the Holocaust and about anti-Semitism. We're cooperating with other mainstream Jewish organizations in Canada, the Friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, to make sure that our community knows we're working all together. And we're particularly emphasizing, Dan, the principle that freedom from hate is just as important as freedom of expression. No one denies the right of people to demonstrate or protest for the things in which they believe, but that the Jewish community is entitled to be free from hate, just as we allow others to freely engage in expressing their views. And lastly, I would say that we are working very closely with individual universities and with Canada's umbrella organizations at the university level to say that universities must not only condemn acts of anti-Semitism, but they must do much more to foster Jewish life on campus. So all in all, we're approaching this at the federal, at the provincial or state level, and at the municipal level, saying everyone has to work very closely together. We're focusing on the media, but we're trying to draw the attention of individual Canadians to understand that just as the Jewish community stands up against oppression of other minorities or discrimination against other minorities, we're looking to Canadians to stand up for us and with us.
Oh, thank you, Brian. You know, one of the things you mentioned, education, which is extremely important, Holocaust education for sure. But I think that many school districts are lagging, or textbook publishers are lagging in telling the story of the contributions of the Jewish people to their particular country, or generally speaking, to civilization. I think that there's been very little of that. I know when I was growing up, it was very hard to find in a social studies lesson those kinds of lessons about Jewish contribution or the contributions of other ethnic groups. So I think we need to really return to that as a priority. Alina, Europe really has been the theater for now a number of years. We were looking originally at France, at all of the anti-Semitic incidents. Now it seems to be continent-wide. You work closely with those agencies in Brussels, those individuals in the European Parliament who are looking to join the fight against anti-Semitism. So tell us about some of your work.
Thank you, Dan. And indeed, it's been a really tough period for European Jews. In Europe, we're used to security guards in front of institutions. We are used to increased screenings, to high fences. And yet these last weeks have been indeed a sign of a really new level, as Eric mentioned, in the US context. And I think if the past weeks showed us anything, it's just how much nonchalant and normalized anti-Semitism was hiding behind this very thin veil of Israel criticism. I think certainly when we look at the past period, it is these pro-Palestinian demonstrations that have been an incredible source of anti-Semitism, often insightful, often violent. What has been particularly worrying is that marches have often been expressly organized around Jewish institutions, around synagogues, Jewish communal buildings, entire neighborhoods, and even memorials to Jews murdered by the Nazis. Much like in Canada and the United States, we've seen Israeli flag burnings, anti-Semitic graffitis, violent chants of murder, of abuse. And I think it's worth noting that these have often particularly targeted women. So the situation has certainly been disconcerting. I think particularly worrying for the European context was the very strong element of Holocaust denial and Holocaust distortion and false equivalences. And I think here the element that you mentioned around education is incredibly important. In terms of the work we are doing, indeed, we are engaging with the European Parliament and especially its working group against anti-Semitism. raising awareness towards members about these various types of anti-Semitism, its diverse manifestations, and really elevating the voices of allies. We are also working with the European Commission, making recommendations for its first EU-wide action plan against anti-Semitism, because as we must be reactive to this current surge, we must also not lose sight of the long-term fight. And here we are speaking of recommendations around security, recommendations around external action and the EU's engagement in the Middle East and North Africa region. We are speaking of measures around integration and migration, and of course as well the promotion of the International Holocaust Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, the promotion of the appointment of national coordinators for combating anti-Semitism, a call for them to put in place national action plans. And perhaps one point I would stress as well is the promotion of positive Jewish life, positive expressions of Jewish life in the area of education, but also more generally in the public space. I think the Jewish Heritage Month in the United States is an excellent example of something that could make a lot of sense in Europe. And for a country that, for a continent that has such a rich Jewish history, it's really important that we highlight this for the general public. So this is something that we are pushing very strongly these days, and will continue to do so in the coming period.
No, I'm just struck by the shamelessness of some of these incidents. And you're sitting in Brussels, and I think it was in Antwerp just days ago, where there's a report of an Orthodox Jewish woman who wanted to share a park bench with someone who was already sitting in that bench. And the person sitting on the bench said, "Get away, dirty Jew." And the first thing that entered my mind was, the reports that were coming out of Nazi Germany very early, where those kinds of restrictions were put into place very quickly, where Jews couldn't sit in a park bench, couldn't do many other things, of course, and it went on from there. So in some way, we're back to this kind of shamelessness. And whether it comes from social media or incitement in some other way, I mean, clearly each day brings, it's not a surprise anymore. It seems to be something that is a daily occurrence. Let's move on the continent now to Jeremy, and who's sitting in London. You went through several years of the Jeremy Corbyn era. Now we call Corbynization because of the anti-Semitic nature of the man himself and those around him in the party. Talking about incidents, another shocking incident occurred a couple of weeks ago was this convoy of cars going down Finchley Road, which is right in the heart of one of the main Jewish neighborhoods in London, yelling terrible expletives at the Jewish community. So, Jeremy, tell us about what you see and how you're dealing with it.
Well, what we've seen in the last fortnight has been really shocking, but I think most people would say it's in no way unpredictable or surprising. So shocking, but not surprising. The Community Security Trust, which actually its job is to sort of report and monitor anti-Semitism in the UK, has reported a more than five-fold increase, more than 500% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in the period between the 8th of May and the 19th of May. So 116 incidents compared to 19 in the 11 days prior to the 8th of May. And I can give you a flavour of what we've seen. So you've mentioned, obviously, one of the most appalling episodes of quite brazen and overt Jew baiting, when a convoy of cars that came from a town in the north of England drove through Jewish neighbourhoods with young men calling for Jewish daughters to be singled out, attacked and raped. And this went on for several hours. It was videoed, and it was going on until eventually the police caught up with the men and they made arrests, and the men have been charged. This is something that particular type of incident, I think many people have not seen before. We've seen a synagogue in Norwich spray painted with a swastika. Free Palestine graffiti daubed next door to a synagogue in central London. The old tropes of what we'll call historic Jew hatred have been on display quite openly. So one anti-Israel rally, and by the way, I call it an anti-Israel rally, not a pro-Palestinian rally, because if anybody other than Israel was killing Palestinians for whatever reason, no one would care. So these are anti-Israel rallies. The protester held up a placard with an image of Christ, and it's an update on the age-old notion of Jews murdering Jesus, and that Christ was a Palestinian, not a Jew. Some people carried flags equating what was happening in Gaza to the Nazi Holocaust, with the Star of David superimposed on a swastika. We have an effigy of an Arab leader who'd made peace with Israel, containing crude anti-Semitic stereotypes, including a hook nose and horns. We've heard instances of Jewish students at schools in the UK being harassed, of Jews saying they're frightened to say they're Jewish, frightened to actually say that they are Jewish simply because they are worried about the torrent of abuse that they'll receive, whether that's physically or online. In universities, it's the same kind of thing again. The head of the British Union of Jewish Students, or communications officer, has said that some students are scared to go on campus. There are 1 or 2 cases of them receiving death threats. Another case, a man stopped Jewish secondary school students in London and threatened to punch them unless they said they supported Palestine. So what we're really seeing here is a naked, transparent display of the world's oldest hatred, updated to reflect the current realities of the Middle East's political conflict. And, as I say, it's quite brazen. Now, B'nai B'rith will always, in the UK, will always, as with around the world, will speak out against this, will condemn this, and will call for a zero tolerance policy. Now, we've had condemnation right from the top. The Prime Minister has condemned the displays of anti-Semitism. Our Education Secretary has written to schools warning against the expression of anti-Semitism by students. We want to see a zero tolerance policy. There's no ifs, there's no buts, there's no equivocation, no caveats. But I think more is needed. So we want, and we call on civil society organisations, including universities, to adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. We're pleased, for example, that schools have trips. They take students to visit Auschwitz so they can actually see for themselves where exactly this kind of the murderous logic of anti-Semitism. But I think what we need is more. I think we need a full-on education about anti-Semitism, how it's manifested, all its tropes, all the canards, all the stereotypes, all the prejudices, and the way it manifests itself in double standards. And I think that education is fundamental, because it's only when you actually can see all the different ways in which it's manifested that you can begin to call it out in the modern world. And actually, on behalf of B'nai B'rith UK, we produced a research document that actually does show how what we would call the age-old anti-Semitic tropes have been regurgitated and found new life in the anti-Israel movement. It's unrealistic to think that you can have a firewall between discourse on Israel and anti-Semitism. And there are too many people who believe that there is a firewall, and all they have to do is just condemn anti-Semitism and leave it at that. It's not enough. You need to have a full-on investigation and education about exactly what it involves and how it's manifested.
Quick question, Jeremy, on the British media. How are they treating this? Is there outrage? Is there apathy? What's the word on the media?
Well, if you're talking specifically about, if it's just about anti-Semitism, I mean, yes, there have been a lot of reports which have highlighted the nature of the problem that we've faced. And I think it's fair to say that some reports are, shall we say, a bit less willing to offer those caveats I'm talking about. So you'll certainly find that there are, in the more left-wing papers, they'll report anti-Semitism, but they'll almost in a way try to say, well, yes, but we have to understand that this is actually all about Israel. And that this is kind of, it's understandable even though we condemn it, whereas you'll have other sections of the media that will condemn the anti-Semitism and they'll report it, but there won't be those kind of caveats. So I think it's a rather kind of mixed picture. But of course, if we're talking about calling out, which they should, anti-Semitism from actors in the Middle East, like Hamas and Hezbollah and so on, that you'll find is it's not really in evidence, unfortunately.
In short supply, but not only in the UK. Thank you, Eduardo. Tell us about Latin America. What are you seeing there? I know in the third day or the second day of the fighting between Israel and Hamas, I know the government of Argentina issued a statement that immediately criticized Israel for, quote, a disproportionate response to the Hamas rockets. Did that kind of statement, which I understand later was withdrawn, but still it was out there, does that kind of statement incite those who are ready, willing, and able to engage in anti-Semitism?
Well, not only what the Argentinian statement did, because the Argentinian statement came not only from the government, but there was an interview in CNN to the president of the country. And the president of the country forgot to say that Hamas is a terrorist movement. He said that if Hamas exists, Israel should be proportionate in the reaction. So it was double because the statement came from the government too. The third thing is that one of the congressmen in Argentina made a statement saying that Israel shouldn't exist. We haven't seen until today, and it happened a lot of days, any sanction from that. So these kind of statements, yes, have made a lot of incitement, not only social media, which is very important all over the region, because there are governments. The problem is when the government is inciting to hatred. Maybe it's not the will because they want us to believe that there is a difference between criticizing Israel and to be anti-Semite. That's what, especially and substantially, the president of Argentina said to the umbrella organization in the meeting yesterday afternoon. But the question, if we accept this kind of dichotomy, we are wrong. I mean, when a flag is burnt in the streets of Santiago and there is no serious response from the government or from the authorities to condemn such a thing, and there are diplomatic relations between Chile and Israel from a long, long time, you are giving space to Jewish hatred and anti-Semitism. And the same happens if there is no answer. In the case of Argentina, if there is not a real good, strong answer, and the real good and strong answer came from the government of Israel. When today, the foreign ministry received the Argentinian ambassador in Jerusalem and protested seriously. I'm not saying that B'nai B'rith didn't do enough. No, B'nai B'rith did. Of course, we expressed ourselves from all over the media in Chile, in Argentina, and everywhere that happened that. But the question is that the decision of the government, then you see it again in the UN. Last week, there was a very important voting in the UN, in the Human Rights Council, against Israel, to try to create a committee to investigate the possible human rights violation and the question of that omitting Hamas. And again, Argentina voted in favor of that, which is the explanation that they are following the steps of Michelle Bachelet. Well, if Argentina and the others that voted in the same token, in the case of Latin America, are following for Mexico and Chile and Peru, etc., are following the steps of the High Commissioner, they are following the wrong steps, because the High Commissioner has blasted Israel continuously, ongoingly, since the very beginning of the position of High Commissioner, and is forgetting all the time the question of terrorism against Israel, and this time again. So it's not good steps. Of course, we have exception, and it's good to say. Uruguay didn't vote last week for this resolution, and it did not abstain, voted against. But what happened in a country like Uruguay? The government took a position, and we in B'nai B'rith, of course, publicly responded to that and backed that. But on the same way, the left, and we have to speak about the left in Latin America, the left in Uruguay, which was government the last 15 years, made a very, very, very bad statement omitting Hamas. I mean, Hamas is not existing, only a conflict between Israel and Palestine. What B'nai B'rith did? Very simple. We went to the media. We went very roughly to the media. Of course, there was a discussion of that because we went to the media published it, and we faced that problem. But everybody is facing all the time in the social media, in the media, and with politicians. But we have to be clear in this, following your question about the countries. We are in a very severe stage of the pandemic. We are 1.5 years with this pandemic. In this occasion of the pandemic, Israel has been used and is very pleased to be used by governments, political parties, showing that Israel is wonderful, is magnificent, the way it faced the pandemic. But not only that, several delegations of doctors and nurses have arrived to several Latin American countries, Uruguay, Argentina, Panama, others, to give the expertise to help them how to face this horrible situation. When the president of Argentina made a statement that Israel is using disproportionate use of force at that very moment, in this situation, the doctors and nurses were working in Argentina. Which kind of answer is that from a friendly government that is giving you this opportunity, is taking from the country, from Israel, doctors and nurses who should be working in their country, and at the same time, what did the government of Argentina do? Fuel anti-Semitism? Of course, but it was an insult to Israel, to the government, and to those doctors. This is an open window for the left, which is the principal problem we have in Latin America. The left has bought the narrative of the Palestinians about the question of the mosque, about the question of Sheikh Jarrah, and about the question of that Hamas is not a terrorist and as a victim. And they are making worse mistakes because sometimes they are so heinous, copying Venezuela's statement or Cuba's statement, that they still think that Israel is in Gaza. And we have to repeat once and again from B'nai B'rith that, of course, we are not in Gaza. So the situation today is not as violent as it is in the United States, which is really scares all of us, and of course in Europe, because we have had violence. I mean, we know that the AMIA was bombed, that the Israeli embassy in Argentina was bombed, that a Uruguayan was killed 5 years ago by somebody who said that he received a call from Allah and it was a hate crime against a Jew because he's Jewish. But this kind of violence we have not seen this time, but verbal violence that we are watching is very important to notice that this verbal violence can bring us another type of violence. We are very happy about B'nai B'rith work and results in friendly countries. We can see it in the voting that happened in the United Nations. And I want to name that because I think it's fair to name them. Colombia, Honduras, Panama, Guatemala, Paraguay, Uruguay, and of course the statement of the OAS Secretary General of it's very important from an international organization saying Hamas is a terrorist organization. But we are very upset of what's going on, not only in Argentina, but what's going on in voting and in what's happening in Chile, in Mexico. We cannot speak about Venezuela, Cuba, or Nicaragua. It's losing our time. And we are watching very carefully, too, what is going on in the elections next Sunday. In Peru, when one of the candidates, which is slightly winning this runoff, it's not only supported by Venezuela, but by Iran, Hezbollah, and it's going to do a lot of harm in all the region. So this is the situation that I can concisely brief you in this moment in Latin America. And of course, if there is time, we can speak a little more about that.
Thanks, Eduardo. And you mentioned the bombing of the AMIA building, which I think the anniversary of which will be observed. I think it will be the 27th anniversary. I think in July, which would be
very closely
now, which is now next month. David, Eduardo's talked about the UN. You follow the UN and you follow the interreligious community. Let's talk about interreligious in the first instance. What are you seeing from the church groups relating to what's happened over the last few weeks? How are they responding to this outbreak of anti-Semitism, serious outbreak of anti-Semitism?
Well, Dan, I would tie the two, and I certainly agree with everything that Eduardo had said. The UN, probably with very little recognition, really sets the tone for so many others in so many other spheres. The press, civil society, academia. And when I say civil society, I include faith-based organizations like the church denominations that we've been paying so much attention to over the course of many years. I'll give you one example. The Presbyterian Church USA, B'nai B'rith, has followed that denomination very closely, particularly since 2004, when it really pioneered, at least in the American context, this very combative and one-sided approach to the Middle East, this very anti-Israel approach. I just read yesterday the latest statement by the stated clerk of the Presbyterian Church USA, just one of a variety of mainline Protestant denominations here in the US. And frankly, as someone who always has shied away from using the label anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic, or being very cautious in applying that label. Unfortunately, by now, I would have to agree with those who characterize the positions of certain churches, like the leadership of the Presbyterian Church USA, as functionally anti-Semitic. You look at statements, and they vary. You've got some that are a bit more measured, a bit more cautious, but unfortunately, you have important, historically influential churches like the PCUSA that are absolutely beyond maximalist in their characterizations of Israeli practices and their perception of Israeli wrongdoing, and just incredibly and unforgivably minimalist when it comes to all of those wrongs, all of those atrocities that Israelis and Jews for so long have been forced to endure. So in the case of the U.S., the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has tried to take a more responsible tone, but other groups like the National Council of Churches, like the Presbyterian Church USA, like the United Methodist Church, and others have shown their capacity for sympathy only with the Palestinians, and shown their capacity for criticism only for the Israelis. And this is something that a pattern that we've seen for a very long time.
Have there been statements directly responding, though, to this explosion of anti-Semitism?
As others have mentioned, and Dan, you know this well, many of these groups are quick to signal their readiness to remember the anti-Semitism of the past, historic anti-Semitism, even the complicity and the role of Christian churches, in the case of those churches, in past anti-Semitism. No comparable readiness to acknowledge contemporary anti-Semitism, no comparable readiness to look inward and find complicity in the violence and the threats that Jews, and particularly Israeli Jews, the half of the Jewish people that live in Israel, experience today. If I could shift very, very briefly to the UN, we've seen in the case of the UN, again with consequences in so many other areas, one step forward and many familiar and often devastating steps backward over the recent period on anti-Semitism. Dan, as you know, over the last year or so, the UN, a special rapporteur in Geneva, Ahmed Shahid, special rapporteur on freedom of religion and belief, issued a first-time path-breaking report on global anti-Semitism. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres appointed for the first time a focal point on combating anti-Semitism. And despite that, because of the makeup of the UN, the automatic majority against Israel at the UN, we see UN body after UN body not only condemning Israel more than any other single one of the 193 member states, but often more than all other member states combined. And this has a profound impact on human rights groups, on liberal church denominations that look to the UN for guidance. They see the UN as authoritative. They assume that the UN is impartial and objective on the UN. We know that that's not the case. We know that the UN is a very political and politicized body. And so when Eduardo references the Human Rights Council, we just marked the 15th anniversary of the founding of the Human Rights Council, which replaced the Human Rights Commission. And in the 15 years, 9 emergency special sessions have been held on Israel. Fully 1/3 of all emergency sessions have focused on Israel. 6 so-called commissions of inquiry or fact-finding missions have been dedicated to Israel, far more than any other country in the world. So whether in the case of the UN or the case of civil society actors like church groups that look to the UN for guidance, repeatedly we see in real life terms the breaching of the 3 Ds that Natan Sharansky had famously laid out, the 3 Ds where legitimate reasoned and reasonable fair criticism of Israeli policy crosses the line into anti-Semitism, delegitimization, demonization, and double standards. And I'll just close with one point that we're following closely. 30 years ago, the UN General Assembly, in a rarity, famously repealed its Zionism is racism resolution. And despite that, 10 years later, 20 years ago, this coming September, the UN held its famous Durban Conference on Racism. B'nai was there, which again singled out only the Jewish state, only the Middle East's sole democracy for implied characterization as racist. And as others have mentioned, including Eric, this canard that the democratic Jewish state and that Zionists are inherently racist, this is something that this is a canard that we're fighting on a daily basis, and this is a battle that we're going to have to fight more and more over the coming months.
Okay, thank you. Alan, you're sitting in Jerusalem. A couple of questions. One, how are Israelis viewing particularly in the United States, this tremendous increase in anti-Semitism? And the other question is, tell us about some of the intercommunal situations that more than flared over the past couple of weeks in cities like Lod and other cities, where synagogues were desecrated and burned. Tell us about what you're seeing.
Well, Dan, we've been sitting here listening to this very grim report from all of my colleagues in different places around the world. And Israelis are watching this very closely. We're very concerned about the outbreak of violence and anti-Semitism that we've been discussing. I think a lot of people here are groping with the question of what we can do from here to help particular communities to face this onslaught, which is really the only way we can describe it. I think one of the things that we've been looking at that is very worrisome to us is the lack of solidarity, and even I go more than that. How many Jews in the diaspora have turned against the state of Israel and have joined these forces that we've been talking about. From what I have heard, for example, in the attack against the Israeli consulate in Montreal, there were Jews who participated in that, and there was a rabbi who was arrested for throwing red paint at the consulate. And we know that there are Jewish groups that have been promoting this anti-Israel narrative that now we are seeing is so broad, and that we've been trying to fight against over the years. Israel is a colonialist outpost, an illegitimate state, racist, apartheid. But there are Jewish groups now that are helping to promote this very dangerous narrative. And so we're watching that from here and are very concerned. And for your other question, Dan, about the outbreak of violence here, I think a lot of people were surprised to find, their Arab neighbors participating in violent attacks against Jews in Jaffa and Lod, Akko. We have, people who are still in serious condition because of fire bombings of hotels and other facilities, people who have not gone back to their homes that have been attacked in Lod, for example, and other places. We had an outbreak of this kind of violence on the part of the Arab community here in Israel in October 2000, when we had the outbreak of the Second Intifada. At that time, there was a very strong response by the police, particularly, and many people have spent the last 20 years or more trying to build back relationships since October 2000, and unfortunately, we've been faced with that sort of situation again, a wide scale of violence. In areas that have an Arab majority in the north and in the south of Israel, and in many of the mixed cities here. And there's a ceasefire between Israel and Gaza now, and Hamas. And I think that's the situation we're facing now between the Jewish majority here and the Arab minority, is a sort of ceasefire to see where this really takes us. Israel, strives to be a fair democracy. We have Arabs in the court system, in the obviously in the Knesset and the legislature, and even now, as we speak, there's a very big possibility that for the first time, a government will be formed in Israel that will have the support of an Arab party here, and in fact would not have a majority without the support of an Arab party and part of the Arab population here. So we're it's kind of a mixed bag in that sense, and I think that a lot of people are waiting for more dust to settle also on the political situation in Israel before we begin to tackle this very grim situation that we've been faced with.
Oh, thanks. We just have a little bit more time. I'm just going to a couple of very quick questions. I'm going to go to Alina on the social media issue. We learn about influencers who have millions of followers, a couple of whom are more than a couple of whom are rabidly anti-Israel. How do we, as an organization, but how do we as a community, how do we respond to this multiplier effect, where we can go back to the Zionism racism resolution, which was referenced by David, which was horrendous, and it spiraled into a terrible path of countries breaking relations with Israel and all kinds of other things. But there wasn't social media at the time. Now we have instantaneously this opportunity to send a message out, which is deleterious, can be very destructive, not only on this issue, but of course on many other issues. How do we deal with that?
Indeed, I think the online space is an increasing challenge, and maybe I would make two general observations about this. I think, first of all, we speak in this dichotomy of online and offline, and I think it's important to remember it's the same anti-Semitism that's out there, and that these two spaces really do communicate between each other, and things that start online have offline manifestations. That's one thing. And the second is that I think we tend to think of the online space as sort of a mirror of what's happening in society. Whereas in fact, I think we should be thinking of it as a catalyst and really as a trend-setting space. A lot of things start online, are expanded online, and a lot of the radicalization is happening because of how information circulates online. it's not just a reflection of what is already there. So this is the place where social media companies' responsibility really comes in. We've been working a lot both with policymakers, and we've been in constant contact with platforms as well to raise awareness about how anti-Semitism manifests itself online. The IRA definition in this context has been a very useful tool. On an EU level in particular, there is an upcoming new legislation that aims to regulate the EU online space, and I think Europe has an opportunity to really set a global example here and impose stricter liability for companies, because at the end of the day, that is where the responsibility lies, but also where the capacity to deal with this lies. For us as B'nai B'rith, I think a point of particular interest is how to equip Jewish professionals to be more effective in this space, in this sort of new conversation. So that's something that we're focusing a lot on currently, to basically develop the literacy of Jewish professionals.
Thank you. And just, David, just very quickly, because we just have a couple of minutes left, there was a troubling report a few days ago about young evangelicals being less supportive of Israel than their elders. And of course, Israel has relied for a long time on that solid support in the evangelical community. So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think this is very much connected to your question to Alina with regard to social media. Young evangelicals, as much as young Jews, young Muslims, and others, are increasingly looking to the online space for their news, for their information, sources that we might see and platforms that we might see as more oriented to entertainment or to social networking, like Instagram, other platforms really are being used by so many, YouTube for news. And I think as the comedian Bill Maher here in the US said a day or two ago, you simply can't get, or it's very, very hard to get an adequate grasp of history and its complexity, of geopolitics and their complexity on YouTube or Instagram. But that's where millions and millions of young people in particular are getting their information. So I think the challenge among younger evangelicals is that we're seeing a drifting away more broadly from the values and the priorities of their elders. And this is something that we really need to take into account in our efforts to strengthen the alliances that we have, both within the Christian community and outside it.
Well, thank you, and thanks really to each of you. We have a situation today that we're facing that we've not, in my lifetime, I've not seen anything like this. And I just wrote an op-ed just yesterday recalling some of the experiences and incidents that my mother had experienced with regard to anti-Semitism growing up as being a young woman in Maine and then in New York. And, you know, many of these issues that we faced in the 30s and 40s and 50s here in this country related to hiring and accommodations in hotels and resorts, and those kinds of incidents of discrimination or examples of discrimination that we thought, you know, we had behind us and that things started to get better. And now we are spiraling into a new phase, a more dangerous phase, perhaps, given the fact that we have social media and instantaneous communication, and that there is an inherent bias out there that has reared its ugly head. Perhaps it's been bottled up for decades, that all of us are encountering. And really, we appreciate everything that each of you do for the Jewish people in your countries, in your regions, and in your communities. So a big thank you to my colleagues, Alina Bricman, Eric Fusfield, Jeremy Havardi, Brian Herman, Eduardo Kohn, David Michaels, and Alan Schneider for bringing their expertise and their insights to this most troubling issue. And thank you for tuning in to this very important conversation with B'nai B'rith. Well, if you found what you've heard to be interesting, make sure you never miss a program by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and liking us on Facebook. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. For all of my colleagues, I'm Dan Mariaschin. See you again soon.